Let's go on a weird and sexy ride into the 1990s. A few weeks ago, a major god in the anime universe, Takihiro Kimura, died. He died young, and he died of a rare disease from consuming too much protein at one time. Which I didn't know was a way you could die, but hey, if you consume too much of anything at one time, it'll probably kill you. I guess now I'm gonna think twice about drinking a protein shake with peanut butter in it. Anyway, this dude was pretty vital to holding together Sunrise Studios throughout the 1990s. If you enjoyed the trilogy of Brigadoon, Gal Geiger, and Better Man, all Kimura. Or the subtle G Gundam references in Code Geass, that was Kimura too. And after he passed, I did a brief video on it where we discovered a few random forgotten skeletons in the old man's closet. And one of them was really interesting to me. So yeah, he has this unsung masterpiece, and it's an adaptation of a weird doujin game. Another thing Kimura is famous for is one of his first jobs was working on G Gundam, and Friday was the 29th anniversary of G Gundam. A lot of people think G Gundam was the greatest anime ever made. There's just something about the insanity of it, the racial tension that gives way to International Alliance of Friends, the shining finger hitting people in the face, and all the cool robot head blowing up. It's great stuff that we see nowadays in Witch from Mercury. Anyway, people have always wanted there to be a G Gundam sequel, but unfortunately we never really got one other than a few mangas that teased the idea. I'm also super annoyed that one of the Build Divers series revealed Domonkashu had somewhat traversed the multiverse and really teased that he was going to come back, but he never came back. Anyway, so like I was saying, in 1997, 3 years after G Gundam had wrapped, Kimura almost had a chance to do it again, only with Waitress Maids. But my god, did this man love himself some Waitress Maids. Now, from this point on, I'm going to be talking about the very pervy anime Variable Geo. And just so you guys know, this is a sexual anime. It's probably one of the most sexual anime I've ever covered on this channel. So I'm giving you this warning, and this is going to be the only one. This is an anime, and it has boobs in it. Now, lately in America, there has sadly been an anti-boob loving population that just absolutely hates seeing boobs, touching boobs, and all the great things that boobs have done for the history of society. So let me get this straight. If you hate boobs, you should just get out now, because today we gotta talk about boobs. Alright, are the boob haters gone? Let's talk about boobs. So yeah, Variable Geo. A minor video game that started off as your run-of-the-mill 1990 Street Fighter clone, and I would say at its peak success, it was about as successful as most of the other Street Fighter clones that ruled the day, King of Fighters, Primal Rage, those sort of games. But Variable Geo had two super unique gimmicks that made it stand out from the crowd. Number one, it was the first and for decades the only all-female fighting game. And while that wasn't much for it to go on, in the madness of the 1990s, there was a girl power movement. And at the same time, this coincided with the early otaku boom, the Spice Mania, and Variable Geo managed to eke out a meager existence for itself in this ridiculous premise of an elite fighting game tournament that only accepted waitresses. Now, the Japanese, they really love themselves some boobalicious waitresses, and to explain that, I guess we have to talk about Ann Miller's a little bit, because that is an artifact about to be snuffed out by history. Now, I have honestly never been to an Ann Miller's restaurant, though I lived in Japan. When I lived there, they were already cracking down on them, and despite hearing the stories, here's what I know. In 1973, Anna Miller started out as a niche diner in Hawaii. Now, they mostly did your typical diner stuff, but they had two unique special advantages. They had a full pie bakery that made numerous fresh, completely brand spanking new pie. And on top of that, all their waitresses had to wear this boobylicious, super unique, attracted maid waitress uniform. And once again, if you have never seen this shit, well, if you've at least seen a Japanese girl in an anime wearing an orange booby waitress dress for at least more than a single second, that was referencing this. Now, while Anna Miller's thrived throughout the Pacific Ring of Fire from the 1970s and 80s, somehow in the 1990s they hit peak levels of being a cultural reference. Unfortunately, once they became a peak cultural reference point, that sadly was the beginning of their demise. Ironically enough, the passionate obsession that made Anna Miller's a hit throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s basically reached peak capacity. And once it reached peak capacity, someone took a long, hard look at them and realized the real only thing special this diner had over all the other diners was that they had maid girls and that they had pies. And that's easy to copy, right? And thus in the 1990s, copycats of Anna Miller's just started to pop up everywhere. They all compete with each other in various different economic ways, and over time, eventually a majority of them evolve into our modern day Japanese otaku maid cafes, where women wait on nerdy men like slaves, but at the same time they get paid by the minute, so they're actually winning out. And thus, in this atmosphere, we come to the world of Variable Geo, a world in which a klutzy Hannah Millers, a ripoff of Anna Millers, contains a waitress named Yuko who is forced to fight to the death against a variety of up-and-coming copycat maid waitresses. A world sadistic and insane, where the very Prime Minister of Japan has sanctioned these fights for his own personal fetishistic stake in it. So yeah, this is pretty much G Gundam all over again, but with waitresses, but also with a horn dog sleazy component that is somehow offset by the fact that all these characters are women, all these characters are fighting for their honor, and there's a little bit of a respectable girl power, pride of a woman thing going on there. Now, at the peak of this franchise, Variable Geo should have just been a one-and-done anime movie that was made to tell the story of the original game. This movie is a little bit R-rated. If not for the boobs, it would probably be PG, but otherwise it's peak 90s anime. There was one sequel made. I haven't seen the sequel, but everyone tells me that the sequel is just a full-blown porno, so I'm not sure if I'm ever going to check it out. Anyway, let's talk about the one that is not a porno, but does contain various shots of breasts. From here on out, I'm going to do a summary of the Variable Geo movie, which came out in the 90s. Alright, so after being introduced by Yuko and the Prime Minister's evil plan to watch booby girls, Yuko gets set up against her first opponent, and she is this badass girl named Kubota, who's pretty much just girl Domonkashu right down to the headband. And on cue, the Gundam fight narrator says that the waitress who wins this fight will receive $12 million and a house. Wow, what the fuck? So the thing that irks me the most about this release, it's a very early ADV Films release, and the show's title is like straight up made in MS Paint. It's trash. Anyway, despite that, the show is giving me some weird vibes, and on the one hand, this show is definitely above your average anime in terms of production values, but at the same time, every once in a couple of shots, they cut some corners, and maybe they cut them a little bit too hard. I don't know, maybe I'm just like being way too sensitive about the MS Paint title. Anyway, yeah, so Yuko's the main character. She's a super interesting fighter. She's got Street Fighter grappling gloves, and what's funny is she fights in some ripped up pantyhose socks. Kabuto immediately grabs her and does a full Bane pile driver on her back and seemingly breaks her spine in like a fatality. I guess she's dead. The manager of the restaurant is so shocked that he faints because apparently he was planning to steal the house that Yuko was going to win. Anyway, Yuka faints and she has a flashback where she remembers that her girlfriend trained in karate with her together and they made a promise to never lose. So at this point, Kubota is about to rip off Yuka's clothes and humiliate her because, oh, by the way, the rules of this fight are that the first person to get naked loses. But suddenly Yuka gets back up because she remembers the promise that she made to her friend, and she uses that promise to gather magical energy, and then she gets super hardcore, ushering in round 2. In round 2, because she remembered the promise she made to her friend, Yuka suddenly has a red fighting order, and she's going to need it because Kubota suddenly has crazy electrical powers. Kubota uses this like water shockwave thing, and Yuka fires a straight up Ryu from Street Fighter Hadouken, which blows Girl Domon off her feet and gets her a KO. Kubota accepts her defeat and strips naked in the street as per the weird sexy rules of this weird sexy fight. Yuka feels bad and says she doesn't have to get all the way naked, but the other girl says that experienced shame is a necessary part of loss and is otherwise pretty willing to just strip her clothes off for everyone to see. And meanwhile, the fucking sleazebag Prime Minister has fully funded this tournament because he just wants to see titties. So yeah, everyone on the street sees Kubota's boobs, a good time is had by all. And meanwhile, an old man walks by and justifies that the fact he saw boobs today made the world a better place. Yuka, meanwhile, tries to stop the old man from seeing the boobs, and so he motorboats her boobs, because it's the 1990s, and sexual harassment standards don't really exist yet. Meanwhile, elsewhere, we're introduced to this German Terminator dude who is intrigued that this one girl has so much energy inside her. Then we go to a stadium where another match is about to occur between this really smart-looking ice cream parlor lady and this really poor chick dressed in an apron. The poor chick has powers kind of like Dulcine from Street Fighter, but also she's a housewife. And meanwhile, the ice cream parlor chick has some sort of giant strategy computer. The ice cream parlor chick pretty much one punches out the poor girl, and the poor girl then gets chloroformed into stripping. After this, the ice cream girl has a flashback to when she had to strip too, and at this point you've seen 3 different pairs of boobs in this OVA. This isn't like a sexy OVA, but there's a lot of boobs in it. Anyway, the bosses now have some dumb nonsense arguments about what power is, and then we go back to Hannah Miller's, where Yuka and her cute friend are done working for the day. A creepy maid shows up in the elevator with them, and they're apparently trying to go to a hospital to visit a sick kid who keeps having non-stop seizures. While Yuka then leaves the hospital, she's immediately solicited by a mysterious lady on a motorcycle, and meanwhile her friend goes home to her sad apartment where she remembers that her parents are dead, and once her brother dies, she will be an orphan, and the only way she can save her brother is with a very expensive operation that she cannot afford. At this moment, the Terminator shows up at her door to make her an offer she can't refuse. Elsewhere in Japan, an old man and a mysterious ninja girl plot to put an end to the non-stop waitress fighting because they don't want anyone to get that $10 million prize money. And elsewhere in Japan, Yuka's friend Satomi suddenly enters the VG tournament against a lady who seems to not be a waitress but is actually a 1980s dance queen, which is kind of retro, but it's the 1990s, so it's only 10 years retro. Anyway, the dancing queen immediately puts Satomi into a headlock and tries to grab her by the nipples. So she then uses a fan to strip Satomi naked because this is a very, very horny movie. And at this point, she pretty much rapes Satomi while they're fighting, making this one of the most sexually gratuitous scenes in the entire movie. Anyway, her clothes get shredded off, but eventually she remembers that she can do a Hadouken, so she does it, and the Hadouken viciously burns the dancing queen to death, getting her her first win in the tournament. Elsewhere in Japan, there's an evil boss lady driving a fancy car. The evil boss lady suddenly gets passed by a mysterious young girl in a sidecar, and hey, that mysterious young girl is actually Yuka. Somehow the evil boss lady sets off for her Killer Instinct tournament, and Yuka tries to one-punch her through the car in the air, and this is amazing. This is one of the best, most 1990s anime scenes I've ever seen in a while, and honestly, this makes me feel alive again. Also, wow, ADV gave this show a full English dub apparently, but I'm not willing to seek it out because the DVD is like $100 nowadays. Alright, by the way, even though this is marked as a movie, it's actually 4 OVA episodes fused together, but let's keep this insane train running. Episode 2. So episode 2 shows an obvious scene we didn't see from episode 1 where the Terminator guilt trips Satomi into becoming a VG fighter. Terminator does this by giving new information that even though Yuka and Satomi grew up together, Yuka essentially ruined Satomi's life by consistently outperforming her in pretty much every situation where if only Yuka was not there, Satomi would have been a winner all her life and not a loser. So while this is kind of coercion to make her realize that her best friend ruined her life and they need to sell a score, honestly he does have a point. Simply by the fact that Yuka and Satomi grew up together, Yuka constantly crushed Satomi down and made her into a loser. And here is the ugly MS Word title screen again. My fucking god, why did ADV make this shit? It looks fucked up. It's so below the quality of the rest of the show, and the complete lack of skill in making it is driving me insane from a graphic design perspective. Anyway, so yeah, this episode for some reason has a slightly different art style than the first episode. The art style this time around looks a little bit cleaner. And when Kubota suddenly comes back, she looks completely different from how she looked in the first episode. Like, honestly, what the fuck? All the characters are drawn differently all of a sudden, and I hate that. It's like this episode had a completely different crew. I wonder if there was like a major like time delay between episode 1 and 2. Because stylistically, episode 1 looks a lot more like G Gundam, whereas episode 2 looks a lot more like Gal Geiger, so I'm not sure like maybe Kimura took on like more of this art style himself, or like he adapted it. Anyway, then we get a new spy girl named Chiho, and Yuka gets summoned to Osaka Station where they meet the Lolly character from the opening. This character looks aggressively like Sasami from Tenchi Muyo, who was like a big deal back in the 90s, but this Sasami has pink hair. At this point, I'm starting to wonder if the unoriginality in the series is either its biggest strength or its biggest weakness, because I'm kind of loving the low-key references to other stuff I know, even though it doesn't make the show seem very original. Anyway, Chiho gets caught spying and she's chased down by the Secret Service, but luckily she has ninja magic, so she does some like magic tricks and escapes. Oh, wait, is she that ninja girl with the old guy they were setting up before? Anyway, elsewhere, the evil boss lady decides to give her nerdy accountant a pity fuck because they need to have a sex scene in here somewhere, so she just had to have sex with literally anyone. Anyway, Chiho catches her in the act, so she gives her some shit for entering her house uninvited wearing a mask, and then immediately she goes into final boss mode, and she shoots down Chiho with a bunch of fireballs while flying around like she's fucking Goku and it's Dragon Ball Z. Chiho, meanwhile, does some pretty typical ninja magic knife tricks and does a backflip or two. Raimi then makes a magical red lightning bolt come out of the sky on a sunny day, and it strikes Chiho dead. You would think she would be dead, but nah, she gets back up, and Raimi is actually touched by her ability to get back up because it reminds her of when she was abused in her childhood. So Chiho does a somersault into a skylight and escapes, and she escapes onto another VG battleground where she immediately has to fight Satomi because Chiho cannot get a fucking grade. Now, it seems like Chiho is going to win against Satomi, but then it turns out that Satomi had the Terminator dude like put some sort of cyborg counterattacking program in her that kicks in when she's like endangered and allows her to like deflect certain attacks as long as she allows computer programming to take over her body. It kicks in again like a second later, and this time it makes her shoot like lasers out of her eyes, and it's completely vague and weird how this thing works. Like, I don't know if she's got like nanomachines in her, or maybe she just has like cyborg eyes now. I don't know, they don't explain it. Anyway, meanwhile, Yuka has driven all the way to Osaka across the country, and it only took her 5 hours. The pink Sasami appears and immediately grabs Yuka in the boobs, and this challenges her to a fight. Meanwhile, Chiho wakes up in her underwear, being tortured by a sadistic doctor lady, who immediately chops up her bra with a knife and friends to whip her in the boobs. At the same time this is going on, back in Osaka, Yuka, the pink Sasami, and Kubota decide to get lunch instead of having a fight. But then the Queen of Rabbits, Arena Goldsmith, shows up and challenges everyone to another fight. Arena immediately sends out their henchmen, and they have a shockingly 1960s Batman fight against them, where we get to see that the fake Sasami fights with a bunch of rocket punches, and eventually all the henchmen are defeated, so now it's boss versus the main characters. So Yuka fights Arena on the Osaka River Bridge. This is a super popular fighting location. I had like so many fights here in like every single Yakuza game. Anyway, Yuka unleashes another Hadouken on Arena, but Arena actually dodges it and reveals that she has a magic death orb that shoots fire. When Yuka is hit by the fire, she suddenly sees Arena's backstory, that she was shunned through life living in Japan for being a foreigner, and eventually she was treated so badly and exposed to so much racism that she became a murderer. Anyway, somehow Yuka decides to absorb all Arena's negative energy, and when she does this, Arena is no longer a negative person. She becomes a happy-go-lucky girl again, and then Yuka hits her so hard that Arena goes to heaven and is confronted by her dead grandmother, who pretty much tells her to die because heaven is a great place to be. But she decides not to. She decides she loves Yuka, and she comes back to Earth. Then it turns out, after all that, Arena was actually fighting the wrong person because her tournament opponent was fake Sasami. Anyway, since she's been defeated, she strips naked and has all her henchmen do the same. And once again, these girls are so happy to strip naked because the loss is a loss, and quite frankly, I think they just like being naked. Meanwhile, the Terminator dude takes off his sunglasses and reveals that he has disgusting yellow alien eyeballs. Super creepy. And meanwhile, the pink Sasami girl has some hardcore pervert kid Saisaishi energy, where she just wants to see all these naked women too. Anyway, the gang goes along, and suddenly Yuka is being attacked by a crazy old man with no shirt, and Yuka is very weirded out fighting the man because up till now she's only fought women, and there are several things different about fighting a man. And for that matter, all her weird special abilities like the Hadouken don't seem to work on men, so sexism. Anyway, the man beats Yuka to a crap, and then his head explodes. Why did his head explode? I guess that's just his problem. Anyway, another random old man shows up at this moment, and he saves Yuka. Then the crazy guy's head explodes again, and a super hot girl runs out and saves him with a mysterious injection. At the same time this is happening, Yuka is suddenly saved by the old boob-admiring man from the first episode, finally making a reappearance. But none of that matters because all Yuka cares about is Satomi, and elsewhere Satomi is slowly being turned into more and more of a robot by the evil corporation. Okay, let's roll straight into episode 3. So episode 3 starts up with some hardcore fan service of Raimi being turned into a cyborg by her mom in the exact fucking manner as Kamen Rider. I don't know if this means like Raimi is a Kamen Rider, but at the very least Raimi is a cyborg soldier created by the Shocker organization, I suppose. Anyway, her mother was apparently terrible to her because she turned her into a cyborg, but she at least died recently, but Raimi still nonetheless has some hard mixed feelings about whether her mother dying was actually a good thing or a bad thing for the course of her life. Now let's see how they're going to wrap up all these leftover plot threads, because we have a lot of plot threads to wrap up, but not so many that it's impossible. So episode 3, Elegy of the Goddess, starts with this random Indian girl with a tuning fork. I saw her earlier, I think she works with the old man. She asks Yuka what the deal was with the crazy old dude that jumped her in the alley, and the wise old man seems to imply that that man was inhuman, but he doesn't actually know what he is. Yuka straight up quotes G Gundam, and she quotes that she has the same philosophy as Domonkashu, that she learns from her opponents and can only understand people through combat. But the old man comes in and says that's bullshit, because his hand can write a love letter, but his hand can also murder someone. So honestly, what's the point of using your hands to understand anything? The old man says that Yuka has to decide whether she's going to continue fighting people who haven't willingly chosen to be fighters, and this foreshadows the fact that she has to fight Satomi at the end of the anime. Anyway, then Kaori, the ice cream girl from episode 1, finally comes back and uses her computer to make a plan to stop Raimi. But just as she's about to do that, Cyborg Satomi shows up and is unleashed to fight against her instead. The Terminator says this will be an unofficial match to test Satomi's power, and the match is mostly skipped over by the anime because it was too expensive to animate. But when we come back to Kaori, Kaori has lost the battle, and Satomi meanwhile has like a giant Gundam looking needle coming out of her neck, which is honestly kind of creepy but kind of cool at the same time. Kaori tries to stop Satomi with a lightning kick, but Satomi stops the lightning kick in midair and almost snaps Kaori's neck. Complete brutality here. Anyway, at this point the bad guys reveal their full plan, and their plan is to put Raimi's mom's dead brain into Satomi's living body. Anyway, Raimi drives her Lamborghini through the window at this point and parks it in front of them to have a big talk, and once again this is another awesome epic anime moment. Now, I don't think Raimi actually knows that these guys are secretly trying to bring her problematic mom back from the dead, but nonetheless she is upset about something. So anyway, Raimi at this point decides to fight Satomi. So Satomi shoots a bunch of energy balls at her, and then she tries to kill Raimi with a fire punch. Somehow Raimi wins, but then after the fact, Satomi gets back up, and it turns out at this point Satomi is just a zombied out cyborg corpse. Meanwhile, at the same time, Yuka and her friends have arrived at the mansion, having fought their way through all the other competitors and skip straight to the final boss. In front of the mansion, Chiho returns brainwashed and challenges the heroes to a fight. This fight is also skipped over because we don't have time for any of that, but Yuka sidesteps it straight into a fight with the Terminator, and the Terminator takes a bunch of drugs and transforms into Damien. Did you know they were the same character? It's a twist. Also, what the fuck? His base form is a strong, put-together guy, but his upgraded form is a strung-out, skinny drug addict? That's kind of a horrible twist. Like, I would have just had them fight him in his base form, because his secret weapon is turning to like an anorexic Jared Leto with Parkinson's disease? How is that an upgrade? That just seems like he became like a crazy, rabid, skinny guy. Anyway, Yuka uses some kind of mental concentration trick to dodge his moves perfectly, and then she easily defeats him with martial arts. Now, at this point, there's a minor and very unclear flashback where they kind of imply that Damien is some sort of shell human created by putting Raimi's mother's brain in the Terminator's body, and the brain having a negative reaction to his body because it's a lady's brain, and they put a lady's brain in a man's body. And anyway, she goes nuts about this, Drug girl comes out and gives the guy more drugs, but then someone freaks out and shoots him to death. At this point, he kills 3 more people, and then Yuka magically purifies him with a holy beam she has, and changes his name to Katoon. And I don't know who Katoon is. Is this a third personality for this person? Well, apparently Katoon was the person Drug Girl was in love with. But yeah, this is a really crappy character because it's like 3 characters in the same body and it's confusing. Anyway, at this point, Yuka finally confronts her best friend Satomi, and as it turns out, Satomi's been turned into an evil robot with the brain of Reimi's mom fully uploaded into her body. And now Reimi's mom is just pure evil in a proper female body. And as it turns out, she enjoys having a female body so much that she also wants Yuka's body, because apparently the whole fighting game waitress tournament was just a ruse, a scam for this chick to find a new body to become the strongest woman in Japan. Anyway, it's all kind of greedy. And Kaori shows up one last time trying to become a surprise hero. But she doesn't get to because evil Satomi instantly kills her. So finally, we've reached the final battle between the 2 best friends. One best friend who has worked her ass off and mastered martial arts, and one best friend who has sold her soul to become a robot. It's kind of a good story arc, honestly, but evil Satomi won't unfortunately get out of her chair, and the internal good Satomi ends up like having a fight in her mind, and she's fighting too to make the evil Satomi not good at fighting. So honestly, it's actually not much of a fight. Yuka just kind of blasts away Satomi's robot parts with her laser, and then she's back to normal all of a sudden. Oh, and Reimi's ghost mom got stuck in the chair. It turns out the chair was the actual final boss. So now they're just fighting a chair, and Yuka fires another Hadouken at the chair, and Reimi's boyfriend gets out of the cryopod he was in. Did you know he was in a cryopod? I didn't. Anyway, at the end, there was a final moment where Yuka and Satomi promised to have a real battle once and for all to settle who's actually the strongest and to settle all their other differences. And this time, the fighting tournament doesn't matter anymore. They're just trying to fight to prove who's stronger because the tournament has completely fallen apart and been abandoned. So yeah, that's Variable Geo, the movie. It ends in exactly the same way as like any 1990 Street Fighter movie, ultimately. So yeah, that was a pretty fun anime. I will say it did seem that like as we went from episode to episode, the budget kept getting smaller and smaller because like episode 1 seemed to have the best animation, and meanwhile when you got to episode 3 they were skipping over like every single fight. But yeah, anyway, after this I checked out the Variable Geo fighting game from the 1995. This is the game the anime is based on. It's just a Street Fighter clone, and like all Street Fighter clones, it of course was on the Super Nintendo. But the best version of this game is apparently the PlayStation port on the PlayStation 1. That version had improved music and pretty significant cutscenes for every character you meet inside of story mode, whereas the Super Nintendo version is just like a Street Fighter clone. It doesn't really have a story, it just has like text when you win and lose and maybe at the end of the game. I would say like if you're a Super NES collector, like I would collect this game just for the fact that it's so odd being an all-one fighting game, but if you want to play the absolute best version of this game, definitely seek out the PS1 version. That's absolutely the best version of it. Anyway, yeah, back to the anime. So this is a pretty weird old anime because back in the day when it came out, it was written off as your average trash, but retroactively, I would have to say that this anime kind of aged like fine wine because somewhere between its rampant sexuality, its light rapey bits, its weird Jekyll and Hyde, everyone has an alter ego, mind control cyborg plotline. There's some kind of greatness to this. I mean, sure, Yuka's overall arc is just to become Ryu from Street Fighter, but overall, this was a fun movie, and it had a lot of surprises that kept me on my toes. All in all, Variable Geo gets an 8 out of 10 because it had perfect action, it had perfect girls, it had at least one boob shot per episode, and cons, all the men in this show were shitty. Like, yeah, honestly, this is kind of funny, but since the show was doing like a girl power, girls only 90s anime, it ironically reverses a lot of the criticism that the macho shows of the 1990s and 1980s would typically get. Like, literally in this movie, all the male characters here are either just here to talk about how sexy the women are, to get raped by the women, or to get beat up by the women. But yeah, despite that, honestly, Variable Geo has aged gracefully. Like, in the 1990s, this movie was kind of written off as just pure corny trash, but nowadays, because people's standards have gone down the gutter so much, I would say this is kind of an unpredictable work of high art. Go figure. If you want to seek it out, it's on YouTube. Otherwise, the DVD is like $100 if you are a connoisseur of this kind of crap. Alright, good luck. Enjoy your girls. Good night.